podcast where nothing's off the table. From Bible mysteries and strange phenomena to the questions that keep you up at night, we explore it all with curiosity and faith. I'm your host, Courtney, joined by my co-hosts Caleb and Jeremy. Together, we dive into the weird, the wonderful, and the wildly curious. So grab your coffee, open your mind, and let's babble. I do feel like I need to preface this episode by saying that I know all of our listeners have been really kind of thinking, especially those that know me, have been thinking, wow, Courtney's a really brilliant human being and has a lot to say, especially in the midst of Caleb and Jeremy. And I'm here to tell you that today I'm a little nervous about this episode. I feel like the facade that I have shown is going to be shattered today. We're talking today about time, God and time travel. So I guess we're going to kind of start out by talking about some of our favorite movies about time and time travel. So hit me with it. What y'all got?
I like Back to the Future, but it's not like it's not on my Mount Rushmore. People, that seems to be a go-to for a lot of people.
I have never seen Back to the Future,
which is shocking because it might
Sorry
be
about
the
it.
most popular time travel movie.
Yeah,
ever.
it probably is.
Well, I mean, it's more of a franchise than anything at this point.
Yeah.
So you're telling me I should go and watch it?
I'm not saying you should watch it. I don't think it's that great.
I wouldn't
movie.
cancel your plans to watch it.
But it's a huge cultural touchstone.
Yeah. I mean, I'm aware of it,
Yeah.
and the car, crazy hair guy.
DeLorean.
That's
Yeah,
about
as long as
all I know.
the DeLorean and Doc Brown, you're all right.
Okay.
Shoes that tie themselves. That was a thing.
Whoa.
Interesting. Okay.
What about you, Jeremy?
Well, I'm of the opinion that some of the best time travel stories come from Japan.
I knew this was coming.
Here we go.
Most of our audience probably isn't super familiar with them, but things like Summertime Rendering, so I could name one or two others that are pretty great.
News.
And most of them have a supernatural element, which when we talk about time travel in the West, we tend to do that through sci-fi, right?
Yeah.
Time travel is a sci-fi thing. We'll get into this a little bit more later, but I think that's to me a purely sci-fi take on time travel is very boring. And that's one of the reasons why I don't like things like H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, for example, which is probably one of the first time travel stories. Which very, very, and it's been adapted into movies and.
So surprising. This is a surprising point of literary agreement between Jeremy and I. It's interesting. Our listeners are probably picking up on this a little bit already, which is that we have very similar philosophies about art and very different tastes in art.
Oh, I have. Yeah, we have very different tastes.
Yeah. So, but the Time Machine is an example of something that we agree on. I'm not a big fan of that. I like other things that H.G. Wells does, but not particularly that one.
I feel like y'all have some overlap though in your
There
art, comic books and nerd stuff.
Yeah, but we like different kinds of comic books sometimes, which we'll probably get into in this episode because I'm gonna make a couple references to comic books.
Oh, nice.
Okay.
But yeah, anyway, I don't want to give away too much.
Yeah.
Okay.
What time travel kinds of movies are you into?
I feel like I hadn't before, like we kind of discussed this before we started recording, but I didn't feel like I'd really seen a lot. But I have seen Tenet.
Yeah.
Which was a very, oh my gosh, I don't even know that I fully understood anything that was happening in that movie.
I'm not sure anyone did.
Yeah, that one was crazy. Endgame, of course.
Avengers Endgame. Okay, so before we get to the Christopher Nolan stuff, because we're going to spend some time on that, I'm sure, but the time, see what I did there?
Oh.
Avengers Endgame, surprisingly, one of the better time travel movies. Would you agree with that, Jeremy?
I would agree with that. Yeah, I think it has one of the most coherent depictions of time travel in popular media, which is kind of surprising because sometimes comic books just kind of like wave their hands and like, oh, it happened because the plot needed it to.
Yeah.
But in game, I don't want to go into it too much, but the idea is that like they travel into the past, but it's not really in the past. They're traveling to a different universe.
Yeah.
And that's how that works. So there was another universe in which things worked out differently, and they go to that one.
They like do a decent job of like explaining to the audience here, at least for the sake of our movie.
Yeah.
Here's how time travel works, which most movies don't. Like you say, most of them are like abracadabra,
Right.
time travel.
Because according to the theory of relativity,
we're going there already.
yeah, we are.
Oh, no.
And this is just kind of a teaser, but the physics behind it is the theory of relativity says that time travel, quote unquote, into the future should be possible.
Right.
But time travel into the past is very tricky and very much suspect.
Yeah.
So to go to the past, you really need some novel creative thinking and speculation.
That you were gesturing so that we don't fall down the rabbit hole of, because I could talk about the Avengers all day.
Yeah, it needs its own episode,
It really
probably.
does. But you were gesturing towards Christopher Nolan, which
Yeah.
I think I think all of his movies. I'm pretty sure I've seen every single one.
I believe that.
Yeah,
Is
and
Tenet Christopher Nolan?
yeah,
Yep.
Okay.
yeah, all of his movies have something to do with time, either with time itself or with our perception of time, like how we understand it or perceive the passage of time. All of his movies have something to do with that. So he's a great like cultural touch point for this topic.
What are some other ones that are related to time that he does?
Yeah, so Interstellar is the big one because the plot of that film is heavily related to what Jeremy referenced a moment ago, the theory of relativity, special relativity in particular. But yeah, Tenet, you mentioned that one. The flow of time is integral to the plot of that film. Memento is more a movie about the perception of time, because the main character in that film can't create new memories.
Okay, I haven't seen that one.
Oh, you got to watch that one. That
Okay.
one's great. And so, because for a lot of that movie, you're as confused as the main character.
Oh, cool.
Because,
Yeah.
yeah, it's really
Well,
great.
shocker for
what
me.
about Inception? So Inception may be the most notable Nolan film, or at
Yeah.
least the one that had the biggest impact.
Yeah, well, other than the most recent one, Oppenheimer, which just won Best Picture. Yeah.
That accepted.
Which, by the way, Oppenheimer involves time because the story is told non-linearly from a couple of characters, different perspectives. And so even in that one, he plays with time.
Interesting.
But yeah, so Inception, I think it does relate to time because in that movie, which is a movie about dreams, and going into people's dreams, the passage of time operates differently in the dreams than it does in the real world. It's slower in the dreams. So yeah. I guess the movies that don't would be like, not directly maybe, are the Batman movies.
Yeah. It'd be interesting to rewatch those though and see
Through the lens of
Yeah,
time.
see what
and
he's
see
doing.
if there are anything.
I'm sure there's something. Off the top of my head, I can't think of anything, but I'm sure there is. Yeah.
So you mentioned Interstellar, and that's kind of where we're going to hang for a little bit and kind of let it launch us into some other theological and philosophical ideas and points. So maybe for those that haven't seen the movie, can we briefly just give an overview of what it is? And spoiler, if you haven't seen it, one, why not? It's an excellent movie. So maybe if you are interested, stop listening to this and go watch it first. There's going to be people that probably don't watch it. So let's give them a little overview.
Yeah. Do you want me to do that, or
Go for it?
Sure. Okay. So yeah, the basic outline, and it is a complex movie, so I'm not going to go into like grave detail, but like the basic outline is like, this is a future state of affairs on the Earth where Earth has become or is becoming uninhabitable.
I think it's like set in like 2067 or something. I was
so it's the future, but it's the near future.
Yeah.
It's not too far, and the idea is like the Earth has become inhabitable, and like they're not able to grow food and things of that nature. It's sort of left kind of a little bit ambiguous in terms of what exactly all the causes are for this, but it becomes apparent that they need to seek some other sustainable place for humanity to live outside of Earth.
Yeah.
And so there is this quite complex, I think, in hindsight, plot about the opening of a wormhole and their ability to go to other galaxies and explore certain planets that might be a safe haven for humanity. And deeply involved in this, when they go to explore these planets, there is this expression of Einstein's theory of special relativity, which means that the passage of time on the surface of the planets is radically different than the passage of time on Earth, which means that minutes can equal years back home on Earth.
And this just to clarify, this is only under certain conditions, right?
Right.
Because one of the first planets they go to is located very close to a black hole.
Yeah.
And this is in the theory of relativity, because of the extreme way in which black holes affect gravitational and other forces, basically time moves slower.
Yeah.
Or the perception of time moves slower on the inside when you're under that effect, under the influence of the black hole, than when you're outside of it.
Right.
And this is a thing that is very philosophically complex as to whether it is time itself moving slower or whether it's our experience of time that moves slower. But that's something that we don't necessarily have to litigate. As far as that goes, the depiction of that in the movie, that part is fairly scientifically sound.
Yeah.
Based on what we understand right now. We haven't experienced that because, thank God, we're not close to a black hole. But, we do use the theory of relativity in day-to-day life through things like GPS. So the reason that GPS works and is accurate is because at that scale, at a planetary scale and movements and stuff like that, you do have to factor in very minutely, but you do have to factor in relativity to that in order to get accurate GPS readings. So this is something that we know from observation and practical data is, it is real. The theory of relativity has real impacts and appears to be correct based on what we know now.
Yeah, so I don't want to get the cart before the horse.
Well, before we dive into relativity,
we're gonna
let's
have to
finish
define relativity at some point,
let's finish the overview. So they're in space. They find these other planets.
Yeah, and so there is a really clever plot instrument wherein I'm trying to think of how to explain this really because it's difficult. They visit these planets, and there's not only do we have this dilation of time because of relativity and this, like, the difference between how much time is passing on the planets, but there is a moment to it. Major spoilers here.
Yeah.
There's a moment in the film towards the end of the film where it becomes apparent that Matthew McConaughey's character has actually been communicating with his daughter Murph through time.
Yeah.
And that early on in the movie, it's set up where they think that she calls it her ghost, that there's a ghost in her bedroom who's been, like, giving her signs. And then there's an assumption made that these are actually aliens, right? That it's like extraterrestrial life.
There's like sand falling from the sky or from the ceiling. There's books falling off the shelves.
Yeah,
just weird things happening.
Things. And so she calls it her ghost. The scientists at NASA that they come into contact with assume that these are extraterrestrials. They think that the extraterrestrials are responsible for opening the wormhole.
Yeah.
And so this is sort of the assumption that is made on everyone's part. But then the big reveal, like the plot twist, is that that the ghost or the aliens that have been communicating with them to try to help them gain access to these planets actually is not a ghost. It's not an alien, but rather it's Matthew McConaughey from the future communicating through time, through gravity, is the means of his communication to his daughter in the past. And so there's this paradoxical conversation that takes place between past and future. And
the way he's able to do that is that near the climax of the movie, he gets sucked into this thing they call the tesseract,
Yeah.
Yeah.
which is inside of a black hole, or
Yeah.
is the black hole. I'm not sure exactly how that works, but
Yeah.
and he's, he basically has all of the past and time laid out before him that he can travel through physically in physical space.
It's like a geometric expression of
Yeah.
all of the moments of time
Yeah, exactly.
within a particular location. And the particular location in this case is his daughter's bedroom.
Yep.
Right? It's like
Mhm.
her bookshelf. So Tesseract, not to be confused with Marvel. This has nothing to do with the cosmic cube.
The idea of a tesseract has been around for quite some time.
Right.
I first encountered it in Madeline L'Engle's A Wrinkle in Time,
Okay.
which also has similar space and time travel properties. And the way she explains it is, well, you think the closest distance between 2 points is a straight line, but if I draw that straight line on a piece of paper, what happens if I fold the paper?
Yeah.
And then you can bring the 2 points directly next to each other.
Yeah.
That's in simple terms, that's a very similar concept of.
They actually used that
Yeah.
that illustration in Interstellar precisely. I think they folded
Yeah.
and poke a
Yeah.
pencil through it, right? So it's a complicated movie. I think a lot of people the first time they watched it were like, "What the heck is this?"
I definitely understood it more rewatching it. Once you kind of know the spoiler from the end, you can kind of see some
It
of the
makes more
themes
sense.
throughout. But yeah, your first time watching it, your brain will hurt.
Yeah,
Like
a
me.
lot of Christopher Nolan movies are like that.
Yeah.
Really, they benefit from a rewatch
Yeah.
for sure.
So there's several different things that I kind of want to, I guess, attack, if you will. So there's this idea of wormholes, which are essentially just like shortcuts through space and time.
Folding the paper.
Yeah.
Yes. So these haven't been discovered, right? But this is just a theory that this could happen. This could be possible. But we've not experienced this. Am I wrong in that?
It's complicated.
Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's complicated because there have been black holes have been discovered, and actually they have actually got a photo of a black hole.
Well,
Um,
I mean, technically, I don't know how technical we want to get, but you can't technically take a picture of a black hole because no energy or matter gets out of it, except, well, they do have some coronal
yeah.
ejection and
So
stuff like
maybe
that.
I should be more specific and say the event horizon, like the what you would see
Yeah.
if you're looking on the outside of a black hole.
You see
Yeah.
where stuff starts to disappear.
Yeah, including light.
Yeah.
And so it's actually really interesting because there's been theory about this. And by theory, I mean lots of very complex mathematics for a long time. And there have even been illustrations by people taking the mathematics and expressing what this would look like.
Yeah.
And then when we got an image of it in the Webb telescope, it actually looks basically exactly like what we thought it would.
Yeah, a black hole, I mean, we know they exist.
We know they exist.
Now, our theory about how they work may be off base a little bit, but in general, everything that we know seems to match the theory. And there are plenty of things in astronomy and physics that are predicted to exist before we actually observe them.
Right.
That's actually how that field of science goes. It's not that we see something weird and ask about it. It's we ask big questions and we say, well, based on this theory that works over here are some bigger consequences of that. So we should see this. And that's exactly what we're talking about here.
Right. So with respect to the black hole thing, it's like that nothing escapes it, but it's related insofar as we're talking about a concentration of gravity.
Mhm.
So this is where we're probably at some point going to have to explain a little bit of relativity.
Okay. Well, so let me ask a question
Mhm.
then about this. So in order to better explain relativity, I was doing some research post watching the movie just to again wrap my head around, and I saw somewhere someone said explain relativity to like a 5-year-old, and they said it was essentially like taking a bowling ball
Mhm.
and setting it on a trampoline,
Mm.
Yep.
and that gravitational pull is going to cause a dent in the trampoline.
Yeah.
Is
Right.
that so? Help our listeners understand expand on that a little bit.
Okay.
I love that. I think that's a pretty good
It's a
illustration.
great
Wonderful.
illustration. Yeah, it's a great illustration because essentially this is the for the sake of our discussion, because relativity is a wormhole to use a pun, that we could go down, that could be, we could talk for a very long time about it.
Mm,
So I'm going to avoid some of the discussion because it's not all of it's relevant.
mhm,
Basically, Einstein's special theory of relativity comes from his observations about um, motion. It
Mhm.
actually has a lot to do with motion.
Yes.
So he was confused, as should be the case, by the fact that the speed of light is constant.
Yes.
Right? It's always the same. It's the same velocity.
In vacuum, when it's traveling through matter,
Right.
when it's in all sorts of circumstances, which is very, very weird because everything else is affected by the environmental
Right.
context.
But the speed of light is a constant. It is a cosmological constant. It is always predictably the same. And but motion is relative.
Mm-hmm.
So whenever you say that something is moving, and we give like a numeric value for how quickly it's moving or whatever, it's always relative to a body at rest,
Mhm.
right?
okay.
So
yeah.
like, so if I say, well, Courtney's running 10 miles an hour,
Never gonna happen.
right? What I would say is that Courtney is running 10 miles an hour relative to Caleb's body, which is always at rest.
That is factual too.
But like,
So imagine that you're running 10 miles an hour next to Courtney.
now we're in fantasy.
and if you can exactly match her speed, then it appears from either of your perspectives, it appears that neither of you two are moving.
Right.
However,
Okay.
everything else is moving.
Right. Except for the fact that I can't breathe.
Yeah, well, there's that. Right?
Um,
we have, we have the sensation of,
Right, but in terms of the motion itself, right? So so motion is relative. The speed of light is constant, and so to spare all the details of this, basically he uses a lots of different thought experiments involving the movement of trains and things like that, and he says, look, because of this, there are lots of paradoxes that arise, right? When you talk about this constant of the speed of light and yet this relativity of motion, and what he discovers through all of these different thought experiments is that it seems like things that are moving at a greater velocity, that time seems to be going slower for those things.
Yeah.
And gravity plays a role in this because gravity is pulling things, objects, towards mass, and so there is a correlation between the amount of gravitational force that's put on something in terms of the effect that it has on motion, and so motion and gravity are very integral in terms of how quickly and how slowly our clocks move.
Yeah.
I don't know a better way to describe this.
This is extremely complex, but so as I understand it, imagine, so you have the bowling ball and the trampoline.
Mm-hmm.
The bowling ball, even at rest, if anything ever is at rest, is making a big dent in the trampoline, right?
Mm.
If you drop another smaller object on the trampoline,
like a marble
near the bowling ball, as it approaches the bowling ball, it will accelerate down into that dent.
Mm.
And depending on where it is in that dent, if it's just on the edge, it won't accelerate quite as quickly. But as it goes further, closer to the bowling ball, it's a steeper dent. So it gets, it accelerates faster. That's the basic idea, except that dent is a variation in gravity, in space, in time.
Right.
That's basically what Einstein is saying. And so it's extremely complicated. I mean, the theory of relativity, the special and general theory of relativity, if you have like a high school level understanding of physics, and if you're willing to fight with it, you can read that in the span of an afternoon. It's very
Mhm.
short. And one of the brilliant things about Einstein was he was able to put it in such um, he's using very basic concepts
Mm.
to where it will blow your mind, but you can read it and you can kind of figure out what he's talking about just with a high school physics education. Now, understanding all of the implications of that is what makes him truly brilliant.
Yeah.
But it is and fundamentally it's not too complex. But the implications and what it means, it leads to some very unexpected stuff like time.
The math is actually, I know it doesn't seem like it, but on the compared to other parts of physics,
Mhm.
the math is fairly simple. Which
Yeah.
again, in mathematics and theoretical physics and things of that nature, they're always looking for, the Occam's razor. Like, what's the simplest, most elegant solution?
Mhm.
Sometimes is the one that is preferred, and so how simple the mathematical expression of it is part of the appeal. But again, the difficulty becomes in our two things really. One, our conceptual understanding, our perception of it, is hard. It's a hard thing to grasp. This idea that, and again, what is the simple idea here? The simple idea is that objects in motion, um, the passage of time is slower
Mhm.
than objects at rest.
Yeah.
So just to clarify, the idea of the bowling ball and the trampoline would represent space and time,
Yes.
and the bowling ball would be objects in motion in space.
A massive, and what I mean by massive is it has mass. So a massive body.
Right, because mass is the thing that creates gravity.
So in the movie Interstellar, when they go to these planets that are in this black hole, right?
Yeah.
Those planets have caused a dent in space and time,
Well,
whereas time moves
So because the gravity is much greater on the surface.
right.
well, the thing about Interstellar, at least the first planet where there's time dilation, it's not the planet itself. Our Earth is doing this currently.
Mhm.
When you think about gravity, one way to think about it is our Earth is that bowling ball.
Mhm.
And the reason we're stuck to the surface of the Earth is because we're tiny little marbles in that dent,
Mhm.
attracted
Okay.
towards the bowling ball.
Towards the mass.
In Interstellar, you get an extreme example of mass, which is a black hole.
Mhm.
That this planet that they visit is much closer to that black hole. And the black hole is many, many, many times more massive than our sun.
Mhm.
So when you reach that extreme example, that has there's all sorts of weird physics attached to it in terms of relativity. So that's why we are experiencing the effects of relativity all the time. It's just so minute, right?
And well,
If you're in a car going 70 miles per hour down the interstate, you are technically experiencing time at a slower rate than someone standing still.
Mhm.
But it's so minute
It's
that it doesn't really
imperceptible.
affect us.
Mm.
When you speed that up to massive, massive differences in mass and in speed, that's where it becomes noticeable.
And this is the last thing that we maybe need to point out here is that this idea about the difference in the experience of time for bodies in motion and bodies at rest
Mhm.
applies not just to people, planets,
Yeah.
and black holes, but it also applies to galaxies
Yeah.
and to larger bodies. So you got to think about all of the motion at play here,
Yeah.
right? So you have the Earth, which orbits around the sun.
Mhm.
So there's lots of motion,
Which is why we need relativity with GPS.
right? Exactly. So you have again the Earth being a marble around the sun, which is a larger object, and then you have the Milky Way, which is also in rotation.
Mhm.
Right, so there's lots of motion that's
Mhm.
going on, and so depending on your reference frame for where you are, what marble you're talking about, Einstein's point is to say because of all this motion and gravitational forces pulling at things, um, depending on which marble you're looking at, so to speak, the clocks will run differently.
Yeah. So we're kind of diving into time dilation,
Mhm.
and this is depicted in the movie, a specific scene, spoiler alert, when they go to this, I think it's the water planet maybe,
Yeah.
and Matthew McConaughey and is Anne Hathaway's on that with him, yeah. Come back to the ship. Their partner that stayed on the ship, they've aged 23 years,
Yeah.
and they were on there for, less than hours, maybe a
Yeah.
couple hours.
Right.
Couple hours.
And then there's this really great scene where Matthew McConaughey is watching videos that his daughter has sent and his son has sent, and he's just watching his kids age throughout the years, and he's been gone for a couple of hours. So let's talk a little bit about time dilation and the slowing down of that. I mean, I know we've kind of hit on it, but
I think now there are the questions that scene raises is more of practical engineering. Do they really have ships and the capability that will allow them to travel to and leave such a planet? Because the physics behind it are pretty extreme. But in terms of like the overall idea, I mean that matches what we know of relativity. That time, if you can put yourself in a situation where you experience that and then leave from it, then that is what we would expect the aftermath to be like.
So this is where we might have some disagreement because, and the reason why is because there are some large questions here that are not often even asked when we talk about relativity. And part of the reason why is because it depends on what discipline are we doing here. If we're doing science, then what science is interested in primarily is in the observation of data in numbers. So when physicists like Einstein talk about these topics, they're much more interested in the questions of the measurements.
Right.
So the question I want to ask is, based on what the observations that Einstein has made, should we extrapolate that and say, well, this is a description of the way that time works, namely that time is relative, depending on your reference frame, or should we say that this is a description of the way that clocks work?
Yeah.
So
Okay.
to sort of flesh out what I'm saying here is
Yeah.
like time dilation is the observation that the object in motion, that our measurement of time for that object will be slower than the measurement of time for the one at rest. So the question then becomes, is time actually moving slower for that? Or is it just that our methods of measuring time are affected by the motion in such a way that that the clocks read differently?
Well, but even when they get back to the ship, I mean, he's grayed. Like, he's
The guy-
clearly older.
The guy they left behind
Yes.
who didn't experience the slower time.
So
Yes.
his body is a clock.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, this
case.
goes to, and I think there's a median there between the yes, it moves slower, and this is something that only affects clocks, which is that our experience of time may be affected by relativity, whereas time in an absolute sense is, continues at the same rate. I mean, at that point, I think it really becomes a theoretical difference without much of a practical application. If we say, well, your experience of time changes, which means that practically you do age more slowly, then that, to me, I mean, we can ask theoretical questions about the nature of time, but for all intents and purposes, if you age more slowly because of the effects of relativity, and it seems like only 2 hours have passed, whereas your buddy on the spaceship has gone through like 20 years, then for all intents and purposes, time has moved at a different speed for you.
Yes, but I guess my interest is in that question.
That's perfectly fine.
Of whether or not there is absolute time.
Yeah.
Because I think what people do is, I guess the point I'm trying to point out here is that people take the relativity observations, and they just sort of throw the question of whether or not there is an absolute time sort of out the window.
That's fair.
And they just say, well, look, time is relative, right? But there are lots of implications, particularly theological implications, if you do away with the idea of an absolute time,
Yeah.
right? In other words, time that is like a true clock, so to speak,
Yeah.
independent of motion and things like that. That's where we're talking about, what is time? What is the
Mhm.
nature of time,
Mhm.
and so forth. Those are actually not scientific questions. Those are philosophical questions.
Yeah.
And so I think sometimes you can blur the lines, but between the two, and think that the scientific observations answer the question. And I don't think they do. I think they're asking an entirely different kind of question, which is, again, maybe a more practical on your day to day life. But in terms of maybe some more fundamental, like big picture questions, they may not even scratch the surface.
I think we're on the same page here. I would agree with that. I believe in absolute time. And this to me is where this is my hot take.
Okay, here we
This
go.
to me is
Brace
where
yourself.
Interstellar rings fairly hollow.
Hmm.
Because Nolan here, it's not just, oh, look at this cool movie about the practical effects of relativity. Nolan is making a bigger claim in this movie. And Nolan is, from everything that I can tell, at least the message of his movies, is a secularist message. And I'll defend that in a little bit. But the big payoff of this movie is with the Tesseract, where they get the main Matthew McConaughey guy is going through the Tesseract,
Mm.
and that is the implications of that philosophically are profound, of what happens in that scene where he's able to communicate with his daughter across time, and they have a very particular way of looking at the world and at physical reality, and it's in the realm of philosophical conjecture that is not supported by the science, and that is making an entirely different claim. So let me clue you in as to what I'm talking about here. As he's floating through this tesseract, discovering what it is for the first time, he makes some weird statements like, "Oh, love is quantifiable." And then the implications of the Tesseract, and this goes back to, oh, we thought it was aliens who made this, but maybe it's humans. The idea is that humanity can master the physical world to the degree to where they can save themselves. They can pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. It's human ingenuity and achievement and know-how that will save themselves, which is directly connected to the other plots playing out in the movie, where his daughter actually solves the equation whereby it allows them to make massive space stations that keeps themselves alive and travel through space, right? So they're implicit in the speculative physics that go behind the Tesseract and communicating across time is the idea that we can transcend the limits of the physical world itself through manipulating the physical world.
Hmm.
We can become our own gods. That's the message of the movie.
Interesting. Because
And
the idea is that they, in the future, in the way future,
Yeah.
they placed this tesseract for him to find.
yes,
They placed even the black hole
yes.
for them to travel
The
through.
implication is that it's not just him talking to his daughter using this tesseract that he found. It's that humanity, at some point in the future, created this tesseract so that he would be able to communicate with his daughter so that humanity could be saved.
Yes, but and here's where we're gonna here's where our differences in
I
our
like this hot
understanding
take.
of art are gonna come through here, because I think that part of what you're saying is true, in terms of like the humanity we can save ourselves. We don't need there's a little bit of an implication, like it's not aliens. We don't need something that transcends human.
Yeah.
There's we can save ourselves. So I understand that theme is certainly present. I don't think that that's the main takeaway that we should take from this, though, because I think that the bigger point that Nolan's trying to make, in fact, I think he's explicitly said this, is that the thing that transcends time space and time
Mm-hmm.
is love.
Yes,
So
but he says, but for Nolan, at least for the Matthew McConaughey character, love is quantifiable. Love is not something transcendent or supernatural or non-material. For Nolan, in this movie at least, and the way it's presented, it is something that is understood, can be understood in material, physical terms.
well, I think you're reading into it a little too much.
I don't think I am.
Yeah, I think you are. The point of the film, because earlier in the film, Anne Hathaway talks about the transcendent nature of love, because she talks about how it's the one thing. He says that it's quantifiable, but he doesn't actually map out in the film what that means.
Because
Right.
he can't, because it's inconsistent.
Well, because it is ineffable in some way. I mean,
Yeah.
that this is so. Whether or not you're reading into the director's own personal humanism or whatever is kind of irrelevant. The main point of the movie is to say that love is the thing that transcends space and time, which I think actually is kind of a could be viewed through a theistic point of view.
It could be.
Because the whole story is, and this is what he told Hans Zimmer when they made the movie, like they made the soundtrack, right? He scored the film, was he actually kind of lied to him, and he was like, it's about the story is about a father's love for his son. And so Hans scored the film. By the way, the score is unbelievable. It might be Hans Zimmer's best score, which is to say, like, he writes it from this point of view of a father's love for their child, and this is so in some ways you can look at it as like, yes, okay, in spite of all of our measurements and time, and in spite of all of our physics, like the thing that saves is the transcendence of parental love. So you can look at this through yes, you could look at it through a humanistic point of view, if that's what we're saying, like the director's point of view is, that's fine. We could get into a whole debate about which is more important when we're interpreting art, the author's point of view or how you receive it. A lot of Christopher Nolan's movies are kind of left with some ambiguity. I'm thinking of Inception, for example, because the audience is supposed to import some of their own interpretive meaning. So if we're talking about the idea of parental love transcending space and time and being the means of our salvation, you can look at that as a very theistic or Christian point of view.
Yes, but that cuts against the entire premise and setup of the movie up to that point, which is that basically the whole movie is about solving a math problem.
It's a sci-fi movie, Jeremy.
It is a sci-fi.
So this
but it's a sci-fi movie that has no place for the supernatural. Love in this scene and how it's conceptualized.
Most
within the
sci-fi
movie.
movies don't have a place for the supernatural.
Well, and that's my point. Nolan, by bringing up this concept of love in that context and specifically saying it is quantifiable, and this is a hot button debate between materialist secularism and theistic views of the world, which is that, is there something that science can't explain? Is there a realm of human experience that is outside of observation of the natural world, right? The physical natural world. And so this, in that context, and Nolan knows this. Nolan is aware of the bigger philosophical stuff he's dealing with here. In that context, the statement, love is quantifiable, which is expressed as if it's some kind of scientific revelation. But that is basically saying love is in the domain of science and materialistic inquiry. That is the implicit message of that statement in that context.
Yeah, I won't belabor the point because I think I've already made my disagreement evident. But I think the question, I guess I would have more of an issue with it. I would take more of a thematic issue with the movie if it were, if he spelled it out a little bit more explicitly
Well,
than what you're saying. If
yeah.
he was like, love is quantifiable because it's a part of your brain state.
Yes.
So it's like,
What
but that's not what takes place in the movie.
It's not, because what I'm saying is he can't do that because it will be laughable on its surface. I rewatched that
You
scene.
know what else is laughable? Travel through the wormhole.
I watched that
it's a
scene.
sci-fi movie.
I watched that scene, and it didn't help that it was delivered by Matthew McConaughey. I watched that scene, and I was like, this is a scene from a comedy movie. Like, this is my hottest take.
Audience, if you hear a noise, it's me flipping the table over.
Let me just clue everybody into this debate that happens actually, I feel like, often between you guys, which is Jeremy has this view of art as he really takes into consideration the author's message and their intent behind their art, whereas Caleb does lean more towards what we can take from art and our perspective on what. And so that is exactly what is happening
but
here.
Part of it, I would argue that Nolan himself, I mentioned earlier, actually intends for the audience to do that. So I actually am taking the author's intentions in play in this respect, which is why, I mean, a clearer example, it's less clear with this one. So I see why Jeremy's making the points he's making, even though he's wrong. But with a movie like Inception, it's easier to identify because, spoiler alert again for another great movie, is he leaves ambiguity, enough ambiguity, because he intends for the audience to take some of the things, there is messaging, but he intends the audience to take some of that messaging and then interpret it through their own point of view.
I would agree with that.
Yeah.
I mean, Inception is just a fundamentally more ambiguous movie, but that's the only way this works. Because if you take his ideology and his worldview that he expresses in his movies, the only way you get away with it is if you leave it ambiguous. Because if you start, if he lays out all the pieces and makes a straightforward case for it, it's incoherent and silly. And my contention is that in Interstellar, he's just a little too explicit about what he's trying to communicate.
Yeah.
And that's what causes...
That seems to be our area of disagreement, is in terms of how explicit we think he's being here, because just the phrase, love is quantifiable, to me, I mean, I feel like I could actually say that in some way and make sense of it insofar as, like, I can quantify love in terms of my experience of it. In terms of my epistemic access to the fact that there is such a thing as love, and that it is a good, right? I mean, there are things that we can have experience. Now, whether that's mapped out through mathematics and physics is a different question.
Yes. I have always disliked this movie. I disliked it from the first time I saw it. This is why.
Yeah.
It is technically a great movie. It is an interesting movie. It's a very cool movie. But I have always had this problem with it, which is that the emotional weight and the climax of this movie is centered on a view of the world and a view of the way, a claim about reality that I think is fundamentally wrong. To get us out of this, and we're just going to disagree on this, but to get us out of this, though, I think that claim about the way the world works and the nature of reality is related to bigger issues of time travel. And is time absolute? Do we have the ability through time travel to transcend our physical world? Or are we subject to the laws of the physical world, even though we can manipulate them to some degree? This is my big problem, just in general, with time travel as a theory. It's similar, but it's even stronger, I think, than the idea that if there are aliens, why haven't they come down and announced themselves? If time travel is possible, why don't we have time travelers showing up? Because the idea is that at some point in the far future, it's very possible that humanity would develop time travel, given enough time, pun intended. And if they have developed time travel at some point in Earth's timeline, and it does work to where you can just go to whatever point in time that you want, where are all the time travelers? And even if you say, well, they would have very strict rules about it, and they would cordon off everything before. Okay, but someone's going to break those rules. where are the time travelers?
Yeah, I think that's it. I mean, I agree with that. Thank God we agree on something, right?
It was
But
getting too tense in here.
yeah, the and there'll be more disagreements like that in
Yeah.
the future, especially if we ever do a comic book episode. Oh
God.
gosh,
By the way, the reason why I dislike Nolan, very, very related to the why I
you say that,
dislike
and then I'll say
Jonathan
why I
Hickman.
dislike you. What?
Very related to why I dislike Jonathan Hickman, who I think is the comic book equivalent of Christopher Nolan.
This is just a personal attack
Anyway,
against
but
me. Is
back
what
to-
this
We
is.
have to stay on topic.
Back to where-
Crazy.
I said I would mention comic books. So I had to throw that in. But back to the
So
word
yeah,
time
so
travelers.
the question about you know, why don't we have time travelers? I don't want to get the cart before the horse, so you might have some questions you want to go to, but I will just preface by saying this gets us into the question because I have other issues with the idea of backwards time travel.
Oh,
at
I do
least.
too. But that's probably the most practical.
Yeah, there are some serious problems with that, and it raises the question that we will have to answer, which is what is our ontology of time?
Mhm.
Also, there are some other questions that we have left unanswered too as well, which is what is time itself, right? So what is time? What is our ontology of time? And because then once we have painted that picture, then I think we can sort of answer some of the questions about time travel and
Yeah.
so
So going back to what Jeremy and Caleb, the feud that y'all were talking about, I see and appreciate both sides,
Mhm.
because I do see the flaw in humanity saving themselves
Of
in the
course.
movie.
Of course.
But to Caleb's point of how we perceive the movie, because I kind of found myself, and I could be totally missing this. So just I'm curious to know y'all's thoughts. Cooper, Matthew McConaughey, is interacting with his daughter from an early age up to, you know, later adulthood in this tesseract. Can we view this scene through the lens of God interacting with humanity?
Yes, and this
That's
is
kind of where my mind went in this scene.
yes.
So let's kind of talk about God and time and how he interacts with us.
So that was part of the point that I was trying to make. And again, there is value. I'll extend an olive branch to Jeremy. There is value in recognizing themes that may be implicit to varying degrees, maybe more explicit than others. That's where I really get upset with films and pieces of art where it is that they make a really explicit claim that's just false, and just expect you to buy it. But there may be implicit to varying degrees worldview considerations or messaging within a piece of art that we should be aware of. So I appreciate his pointing out where this could be implied.
Yeah.
But to your point, if there is any validity in our taking our own perspective on interpreting the piece, then this idea of a parent's interaction with a child in through motivated by love across space and time, even in ways in which the child may not initially or on the surface perceive that interaction. I think you can make a correlation to the relationship between the divine and humanity,
Right.
because this is a question about, well, if God, our heavenly Father, so to speak, is transcendent in some way, and we are temporal beings who live in a timeline, what is the relationship between the transcendent God and the time-bound humanity? How do we parse that out? I'll put my cards on the table and say that I think this is the question that everyone wants to answer, right? This is the thing that we want to scratch this itch. How does God relate to time? But I think the issue, this is where we get into, there's been more nonsense written about time and God's relationship to time than just about anything else.
Finally, something we can agree on.
Yeah, there's so much nonsense, and the reason why I think is because people jump to want to answer that question, and they haven't asked the more fundamental questions, which is what is time, and what is its ontology? Because if we have a clear picture of we have to establish what we're talking about
Okay.
before we can even answer how God relates to it, right? I know that's the part we want to get to, right?
Yeah.
We want to say, how does God relate to time? But I think we've got to do a better job. I say I'm talking about like theologians, the church, Christians. I hear lay people in the church, and I've said things like this in the past before I thought more deeply on the subject, where we'll just make assertions about God and his relationships to time without really giving much consideration to what it is we're even talking about. And we haven't the trickle down effects of that are huge in terms of
Mhm.
our theology of free will, our theology of prayer, our
Mhm.
theology. I mean, it's really practical. I
Yeah.
know that this episode probably sounds like sci-fi because that's what we've been talking about, but some of the ramifications of what we think about this are hugely practical.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, so then let's dive into time. What is the definition of time?
so
How do we view that?
there is no such thing as the definition of time because there's lots of debate about this.
Okay.
So when we talk about this, and for the sake of this episode, I'm just going to tell you what my understanding of time is, and God's relationship to it. So you have basically two options as far as I see it. And Jeremy, you can weigh in if you think I'm missing something. There are a lot of options, but these are the main two in terms of what time is. You can either say that time is a substance. That is to say, it's a thing that exists. And that thing is the thing that makes change possible.
Mhm.
Okay. And this substance that we call time, this thing we call time, is that which makes change possible. It is the source of moments, and it is the thing that orders those moments into a timeline.
Okay.
Okay. That I think is it on the substantival view is the bare bones definition. The other alternative to that is to say, well, time isn't really a thing. This would be called the relational view of time, which is to say, time isn't actually a thing that exists, but it's just the relationship um, of change, right? So it's basically, in other words, there would be no time in the absence of change. So when we talk about time, we're just talking about change. So those are the I would say the primary two. There are fringe alternatives, but those are the primary two options in terms of what we're talking about when we talk about time.
Okay.
Um, I don't know where you fall on this. I have my views have sort of evolved over the years. I've read there's a lot of really good Christian philosophers who've done good work on this.
Mhm.
William Lane Craig is one who's done a lot of really good work on it. He would fall under the category of relational, right? He
Mhm.
basically says like in the absence of change, there is no time. Time is just a description of change. Um,
Right.
there are others like R.T. Mullins, who is a very, very good Christian philosopher. I've actually corresponded with him through email recently. He's written some really good books on the subject. Richard Swinburne is another who would take, I think, something closer to the substance view. I've seen myself leaning in that direction to say that time actually is a thing. That makes change possible. I'm motivated to say that because it seems to me that whenever we talk about change, if I ask the question, well, what is change, right? If you take the relational view and say, okay, time just is our description of change, and then I ask you, well, what is change? It seems like inevitably, whatever you answer, you're going to bake time into it.
Right.
And so it seems like we actually need another category for something else.
Part of this is the problem of we're like a fish trying to describe water, and
Mm,
we've never been out of the water.
we're swimming in it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So on a basic level, I would say that time is a thing that makes change possible. It's the source of moments, and it orders moments into a timeline. Now, I should probably distinguish what I mean when I say moments,
Mm.
right? Because a moment of time and time itself, I'm making a distinction that they're not the same thing.
Mhm.
So a moment of time, on my understanding, would be a, um, a state of affairs, which is the way things are, but could subsequently be otherwise. And R.T. Mullins is a good source on this. He talks about the the way things are, but they could subsequently be otherwise. They could be different than they are.
Yeah.
It's like a snapshot.
It's like a slice of reality.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what a moment is. And because it's baked into this idea of the way things are, but they could subsequently be otherwise, that's a single moment. When there are subsequently otherwise, that's another moment. Now we have two moments.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? So the two moments now create a timeline
Mm-hmm.
because we have more than one slice of reality. And so, and if you pile up enough of them, then you have duration,
Right.
right? So it's a bunch of slices of reality, a bunch of moments, the way things are and could subsequently be otherwise. And so, I think that that's a good description of what time is. Now, the question related to time travel that we've been sort of getting at with all these
Yeah.
movies and stuff is the question of, okay, which moments exist?
Mhm.
And this is the question of the ontology of time.
Yeah.
Which moments are real?
And implicitly real now.
Yeah.
Not just were real, did exist, or will exist, but which ones are real
But
now.
are real. Yeah.
In other words, which ones do we have potentially access to?
Yeah. And so bear with me. I know I'm doing a lot of talking here, but I'm trying to just define some terms for us. So this question, so we've already answered the question of what is time, right? It's the thing that makes change possible. It's the source of the moments. Now we're asking the question of the ontology of time, which is to say, which moments exist?
Mhm.
Now that we know what the moments are, which ones are real now, right? And you have essentially, again, two options on how to understand this. You can take what is the eternal, eternalist view, right? This view that eternalism is basically that all moments exist,
Simultaneously,
right?
all at the same time.
Simultaneously, although there may be a earlier than
Yeah.
and later than relationship, right, in
Right.
terms of our perspective,
Right.
right? But that's just a
Okay.
perspective, right?
Yeah.
But all of the moments are real.
Yeah. This is kind of like, to put it in like physical terms, it's like all of time ever, any time at all, is like a big basketball.
Hmm.
And if you could step outside of it, you could hold it in your hands and turn it around and look at it and look at different parts of it.
Yeah, I hear philosophers sometimes will use a similar analogy, but they'll call it a block,
Yeah.
right? It's a four-dimensional block, and all of the moments are contained within the
Mhm.
block.
Which is exactly what happens when the astronaut in Interstellar goes into the Tesseract.
Yeah.
Right. So they're making an assumption,
Mhm.
for the sake of the plot of the movie, which is to say, like, yeah, this eternalism is true. All of the moments that he's prodding at her bookshelf,
Yep.
in the Tesseract, and it's in various moments throughout her life. Why? Because all of those moments exist.
Yeah.
Right.
The trick is just figuring out how to go from one to the other,
Right.
how to traverse them in a way that gives you access to them. But they're all there. You just have to,
They're all
manipulate them.
equally real. But the question is your reference point. Where are you looking? Right. Well, a person is a prisoner of what we call the present because of their perspective, but all the other moments are equally real.
Yeah.
So the analogy with God, you made this point earlier, Courtney, about, well, can we look at Cooper as God? Yes, this is a good analogy actually, because if you take an eternalist view, God is like Cooper in the Tesseract, insofar as he is outside of the block in a sense, in some way, and yet he has access to the block.
Yeah.
And can access the different moments of time that exist.
So I have some follow-up questions for that specifically, but even just thinking of like time travel. So would you say the reason that we can't time travel is because we are bound to time? And would you consider God to be a time traveler because he interacts?
If we take the eternalist view
Yeah.
that all of the moments of time exist, then yes, I think something like that would be true, because what we would say is that because of our nature, we are prisoners of our
Mhm.
perspective of time,
So
which is the present moment.
in order for time travel to happen for us, we would have to escape the reality of time and be
We would have to
outside of.
we'd have to get out of the block,
Yeah.
like Cooper in the movie, right? In some way, we would have to have or have divine intervention, or have something like that that gives us access to the block to be able to see all the different moments.
Okay. So what's the other view besides
The
eternalism?
other one is the correct view.
Okay.
in,
Interesting.
in my opinion, okay, and I'm going to give a couple of arguments. I'm sure Jeremy has arguments as well. I don't know where he falls on this question, but I think that the other view is called presentism.
Mhm.
And presentism says actually sort of the opposite is true,
Okay.
insofar as the only moment of time that exists that is real is the present moment.
Yeah.
And no other moments exist. And by that I mean the past moment no longer exists. It did exist
Mhm.
on the timeline when it was the present moment. But remember what my definition that I gave earlier, which is not mine, it's taken from other philosophers and thinkers, that a moment is the way things are, but could be subsequently otherwise. The moment that the way things are becomes subsequently otherwise, a
Yeah.
new moment exists, and the other one ceases to exist
Yes.
because it's no longer the way things are.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
so the claim here would be that only the present moment exists. The past moment has ceased to exist, and the future moment is only potential. We're not talking about something that actually exists because it hasn't become subsequently otherwise, right?
Right.
And and on this view, this is actually, I think, a much simpler view of reality, because what we're claiming is that the totality of reality is made up of a single moment,
Mhm.
the present moment. Now, we can talk about the timeline in terms of moments that used to exist but no longer exist, and we have memories of those, and we can
Right.
make record of them and so forth, but they don't exist anymore.
I'm much more sympathetic to this view than the other, but there is a problem for this view, right?
Okay.
Which is that if it is the case that the present is all that exists, then how is change possible? How do you get from what is to one of those
To
potential
what will
states?
subsequently be
Yeah.
otherwise, yeah.
Which is that, which, in terms of, and it sounds like a very nitpicky thing, but it's actually very important,
Mm.
right? Which is that, okay, so if like the coffee is hot now, it will be cold in 5 minutes. If the present is all that exists, why doesn't the coffee stay hot forever? Because that's the only thing that exists. How is change possible? Like how do we understand the relationship between these discrete moments?
Mm.
And what is the magic that happens to get us from one state at one moment to a different state at a different moment? What's the bridge there if the present is all that exists?
So the definition that I gave earlier for what time
Mhm.
is that time is the thing that makes change possible,
Yeah.
and is the
Exactly.
source of moments, and is the thing that orders those moments.
Mhm.
And so I agree. I see the thing that's the trouble,
Yeah.
right? The
And
trouble
I'm
here.
not saying this is debunking. I'm just raising
No,
it
yeah,
like,
yeah. This is a natural question to ask, which is like, okay, so we get a plurality of moments, so we get a timeline, because of change. Change is okay, but what is it that makes change possible? And what I'm attempting to say is that time is the thing that makes change possible. Now, I know that the listeners are probably thinking, you got to spell this out a little bit more. Like, what does it mean to say that time makes change possible? How does that work? I think as Christians, what we would want to say is something like, God is the source of time,
Mhm.
or that time is an attribute of God, let me explain. I can see that Jeremy is squirming.
Attribute makes me nervous.
Yeah. So when I say attribute, I just mean it's a property that falls out of his nature. Insofar as you have God before creation.
Mm-hmm.
So creation ex nihilo means like it's contingent. God can decide whether he wants to create or not. He exists. Part of what it means to have creation ex nihilo is to say that God exists without creation in some way by himself.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have a way things are with God, but they could subsequently be otherwise. How? Because God can choose to act.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I want to say is it's somehow, and this is a little bit mysterious, but it's somehow rooted in God's agency. Yeah. And so his ability to choose to act.
Yeah.
And so because he chooses to act, now we have not only the way things are, which is God by himself, right? That's you think of that as a moment, right? A singular moment. There's no timeline. There's no succession.
Yeah.
So it's just, you don't have a problem of an infinite past because it's actually just one moment.
Right.
It's not accurate to say a timeless moment, but it is a singular moment, the way things are. And then when he acts, when he uses volition or free will to create, now we have the way things subsequently could have been otherwise.
Right.
And so now you have two moments.
Right.
And so I hope you can see that how this would create from the first action, it creates a timeline.
So what you're saying is, we know that God is able to act.
Mm-hmm.
I think every person who believes that God exists would say that, right? If he is able to act at all, which we're assuming, then there has to be a potential for change. The potential for change in the state of affairs of the universe requires time.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, however we describe God's relationship to time, the fact that God exists and is capable of acting necessarily implies that there is time.
Yeah, and I would want to say that if that's the case, then in some way that has to be grounded in his nature.
Yes, I would agree with that.
Because if God is we want to say as Christians that God is the sole, ultimate, foundational law of reality.
Yes.
Right? So before creation ex nihilo, before he says, let there be, he is the only thing that exists.
Yeah.
But if we have this potential for change, then it implies that what we're calling time, or the thing that makes change possible, is in some way essential to God.
Right.
And it's tied up in his agency and his freedom to act.
Or at the very least, an inevitable necessary consequence of who he is.
Yes.
This is similar to, so for our listeners, there's some very cryptic things about wisdom written in Proverbs, right? About the nature of wisdom, and without going into, Christology and the way that wisdom might be operating in Proverbs, when you think about it, it's like, well, if the world was created by wisdom, was wisdom created first? We say that God is wise, right? Does that mean that like wisdom is something distinguishable from God, but that always existed? And then would that mean that there's something other than God that is eternal? These are very complicated theological questions. I don't think we can fully litigate them here, but this is one of those questions, right? Time's relationship to God is caught up in the same types of philosophical problems as, did wisdom always exist? Is it an attribute of God? What does it mean that something is an attribute of God?
Right. So I want to pass it to you, Court, and have you sort of like probe this a little bit, because I know we've sort of thrown a lot on the table here, but I do want to make the clarification that the definition that we've just mapped out is predicated somewhat on what we think about the nature of moments and which moments exist. I think a lot of Christians, but this is anecdotal, and it's based on reading I've done, but also lots of just conversations I've had with just, your average Joe. I think kind of just assume a eternalist view, and they want to say, and I think maybe it's I don't really know what it's motivated by. Maybe it's motivated by the wanting to have God as being transcendent,
Mhm.
but wanting to say that there is this block of time with all the moments and God is outside of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm not quite sure. I really want to dive into like free will, but I feel like that's probably a different episode that we can get into.
Mhm.
So maybe let's just talk a little bit about how can we view in relation to time and like prophetic words and vision. Because that's specifically for like the future. So I guess I have a couple of questions. One is, um, how does prophecy and like visions that God gives us, if those haven't happened yet or aren't happening simultaneously, how do we interact with that? Well, maybe let's just start there. Yeah.
So I'll try to be brief about this because, like you said, I think we can have future episodes of
Yes,
some of these
we're gonna need
questions
to.
because what I want to say is that there are our understanding or our concept of time and God's relationship does have a lot of ramifications for things like free will, how we
Mhm.
understand free will. And so we can dive into that later. I'll just say this: we haven't gotten there yet, but it's important. What does biblical Christianity actually commit us to in terms of what we think about time and God?
Yeah.
Because I think one of the reasons why people jump to the eternalist kind of point of view is because it's a very, and I'll give it credit for this, it is a very easy way of understanding how God has knowledge of the future.
Right.
Mhm.
So if
He is kind of like the ultimate time traveler.
yeah,
So he has seen it all already, so he
Yeah.
can tell us about it.
yeah, he's the maximal Cooper
Yeah.
who has access to the tesseract because he created the tesseract, right? And so it's like it's this ability to say, look, if time exists in this block and God has access to be able to look at it, it's very easy to explain things like prophecy, right?
Mhm.
Because you can say, well, God just looks at the point in the block and sees what's going to happen. He peeks into the future. I mean, people in Pentecostal circles love to say, God has already been to your tomorrow,
Yeah.
Yeah.
right? Things like that. And I want to say, has he?
Yeah.
Has he?
Well, that's the problem with free will, right? And I'm just reminded. This is why I really want to get there, but
Yeah.
I think Endgame is really. I think we need to have an episode on that, and really, I'm just reminded of vision and like seeing all.
Yeah.
That's the problem is
the-
that there are limitless possibilities as to what the future could be.
Yes.
Uh,
I think that if we understand prophecy and foreknowledge through time travel,
Providence, yeah.
if we understand that through time travel, that's actually a very limited way of understanding God's omniscience. And it boxes us in to certain highly debatable and I think very suspect theological positions.
Yeah.
So if this has implications if we take the eternalist view that all the moments of time, past, present, future, exist, and God is kind of like outside of them looking in and observing them.
Which I have a hard time really even understanding what that means.
Yeah. But, well, and we also and that boxes us into the fact that like, oh, some people are going to be saved or not, no matter what. And it does have problems for free will. But there's a more foundational problem for that view, I think, which is that what do we know about the nature of God from the Bible? We know many things, but in this context, two things are important. Number one, God is eternal. God exists independently of the universe, right? He has always existed. He will always exist. He does exist.
Would
now.
you be comfortable with the definition of eternal? Because I don't want the listeners to be confused with eternalism, right?
Yeah.
This view that all the moments exist.
mhm.
Would you be comfortable in saying that what the Bible actually commits us to with respect to God being eternal is that he has no beginning
Yes.
and he has no end?
That's right. He is entirely independent. His existence is entirely independent of time.
Right.
That's number one that we know about God. Number two that we know about God is that God entered into time through Jesus,
Right.
the incarnation.
Mhm.
Now, if time, and again, you can explain this as, well, it's a mystery. We don't really know how God works, and the incarnation is a mystery fundamentally. Okay. But if you take the eternalist view of time to say that all of these moments exist simultaneously, then you have some extra work to do to say, okay, God has existed independently of time and stands outside it. But at one of these particular moments,
At least one.
at
Yeah.
least one, he decided to enter into time.
Right.
And what we know from scripture says he never fully detached from time
Mm.
after that point, right?
Yeah.
He still has a physical bodily existence
Yeah.
today.
So the point that you're driving here
Mhm.
is to say that there has to at least be, at least with respect to the incarnation,
Mhm.
there has to be a temporal God,
Yes.
a God who has a direct correlation to time.
Yes.
And based on the definitions that I've sort of argued for throughout this podcast, is to, I think I want to take it a step further and say that okay, I want to ask the question: what does Scripture commit me to? Scripture commits me to the notion that God has no beginning and that He has no end. Now, this might surprise some of our listeners who take some of this stuff for granted, but that's all that it commits us to with respect to God's relationship to time.
Exactly.
And that He has knowledge of the future.
Right.
But remember, those questions of knowledge that's questions of God's omniscience. It's not even really talking about time. It's talking about God's knowledge.
Yes.
That He
And
knows
I
things.
would agree with that totally.
So what I want to say is, if all Scripture commits me to is that God has no beginning and He has no end, then there are a variety of ways that I can flesh that out.
Mhm.
And we've really jumped the gun if we assume that eternalism is true. So I think what I want to say is that I don't even know how a God who's outside of the block, I don't know how, if He is outside of time, how could He interact with beings who are in the block?
At the
It
very
seems
least,
incoherent to
at
me.
the very least, you have to deal with him being outside and inside at the same time. And if you make his omniscience a matter of him being outside, then he comes inside. I mean, it's not impossible. You could develop some plausible
you're gonna get
explanations,
some serious
but
apparent
you're
contradictions.
creating problems for yourself. And my other, and this goes back to my hot take. I don't know if I want to drag us back there as we're probably about to wrap up.
Yeah.
But I think the reason why we're so predisposed to an eternalist perspective, to say that all of time exists simultaneously in some sense, is that a secularist materialist view of the world needs that to be true. Because as we see in the movie, if that's true, there's a chance we could pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps. It gives the potential for human agency. It drastically expands the potential for what we can do by interacting with the physical world in terms of being our own savior.
We can probably do a sequel to this if we wanted to, because I think you could make arguments to say that if eternalism is true, that actually I don't even know how to make sense of the idea that you are the same person.
Yes.
In each of those moments.
That's right.
I mean, think about it. Avengers Endgame, right? If you go back in time, you might
Right.
encounter yourself.
Right.
Which one's the real you, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's lots of questions that we could probably talk about in the future. But I just want to say that if God is the source of moments, if God is the thing that makes change possible, and He's the one who orders the moments into a timeline through His creative will, then I want to say that the God that we worship, though He has no beginning, if He's the source of time, then He is, by definition, in some way at least, temporal. Insofar as what we think of as time comes from Him, because all things come from Him through His creative will.
Yeah.
And so, I think the word of caution is we have to do a better job of thinking more deeply on these topics than before we make assumptions.
Yeah. I'm not going to promise that our very next episode is going to be the sequel, but I do think that just for time's sake, I do want to get into free will, even just like the incarnation of Jesus, and even more so too, like the future and what eternity looks like
Yeah.
post the here and now.
Which
So
doesn't make any sense on eternalism, by the way. But
so saying that to say, if you're listening, like, subscribe, follow us, because we will do at some point a follow-up to this. So thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.